I've always said that Bitcoin is the ultimate financial IQ test, you know? And what raises your financial IQ is when you realize that I'm using the wrong unit to measure everything. I'm using something weak to measure when I should be using something strong to measure. Let me give you an example of this, and then I'll go to some of your questions, just in case you have them. Most of you are still somewhat shy to ask your questions, but all right, it is what it is. All right. But I'll give you an example of this. You have a son that is very interested in becoming a professional, I don't know, a professional soccer player, let's put it that way, football player in outside of the US, soccer player in the US. And your son is 6 years old, you're starting him off on his pursuit to be really good at soccer, but you make sure that all throughout his development that he is compared against the weakest of all, that you make sure that your 6-year-old son is in the soccer league with 3-year-olds. And then when your 6-year-old son is 9 years old, you make sure that your 9-year-old son is playing with 6-year-olds. And you ensure that you can only measure your son that wants to be the best against the weakest of all. You want to make sure that he is constantly shown as being superior, as being good, as being above average, because what you're comparing, you're going to make sure that what you're comparing your son to is weaker than your son. But if you were to ever take that 9-year-old son and compare the 9-year-old son to a 25-year-old man, there would be no comparison. If you were to take that 9-year-old son and compare that 9-year-old son that's used to playing against everyone inferior to him to a 15-year-old, no comparison. Even to a 9-year-old, no comparison. A 9-year-old who wasn't subject to being compared to the weakest of all. This is what we do when I create that analogy. This is what we do when we compare things to fiat currency like the US dollar. When you take Tesla and you compare Tesla, the asset, to the US dollar, that's like taking your 9-year-old and comparing it to a 2-year-old in soccer. The 9-year-old will always beat the 2-year-old. That's no comparison. But let's put Tesla against someone strong like Bitcoin. Now, how does it compare? Why are we comparing our assets to the weak? Why? Why are we doing it? Why are we taking every asset, Tesla, Nvidia, the NASDAQ, the S&P 500, and you don't take your money out of this false system? Is We're going to trick you into comparing these things to the weak all the time so that you never leave the system. Because if you were to ever understand that I'm supposed to compare what I do to the strong, Bitcoin's the strong. That if I were to ever do that, I would stop comparing to the weak and I would keep my money in the system. But because Bitcoin is out of the system, no one wants you to compare to it. No one wants you to take Tesla and compare it to Bitcoin. No one wants you to take Nvidia and compare it to Bitcoin. No one wants you to take the Nasdaq and compare it to Bitcoin, the S&P 500 to compare it to Bitcoin, US Treasury to compare it to Bitcoin. No one wants you to compare outside of the system. They want you to stay comparing to inside of the system because that's the lie. That's the picture that will always show you that you're winning when you're not winning. And so when I tell you that I've always said that Bitcoin is the ultimate IQ test, it's the IQ test to understanding that there's a unit that I'm comparing everything to. Americans have this, they are so privileged that they don't even understand that everything they look at is a pair. They don't even understand that when I look at Tesla, I'm looking at a pair, Tesla and the US dollar. You see, most of the world outside of the US understands pairs. They understand they're comparing an item to a fiat currency because in much of the world, they've been forced to compare their shitcoin or their paper money printed by their government with the paper money created by the US. So they've lived a life of comparing two items, my currency compared to the US dollar. Because Americans have the one compares to, they have lived this cushy life of not comparing. And so they're soft when you're considering the price of something. And so if I compare the US stock market to the Venezuelan bolivar, it's a meteoric rise up. If I compare the US stock market to the US dollar, it's a rise up, but it's not as meteoric as comparing it to the Venezuelan bolivar. So they have two different trajectories up. One is literally vertical, and the other is up sharply, but it's not as vertical. The US dollar picture of the Nasdaq and the US dollar is up sharply, but it's not up the same way if I change the unit from the Nasdaq to the Venezuelan bolivar. The Nasdaq compared to the Venezuelan bolivar is a straight line straight up. The Nasdaq compared to the US dollar is straight up, but it's a little more slanted to the right. But when I take the Nasdaq and I change it, I change it from from the Venezuelan bolivar, from the US dollar to Bitcoin, now the chart's the other way. The Nasdaq is collapsing. It's rising against the Venezuelan bolivar, straight up. It's rising against the US dollar, not as sharply, but it's still rising. But when I change it from the Venezuelan bolivar, no, not that one, US dollar, no, not that one, and I just switch it, the NASDAQ and the Bitcoin, then I see the NASDAQ is a shitcoin. But no one wants you to compare your items to Bitcoin because you will leave the system. And this is what I mean by understanding Bitcoin. Bitcoin is the ultimate financial IQ test, especially for Americans. That Bitcoin is showing how privileged and ultimately low IQ most Americans are because they have no concept of pairs. They have no concept of a unit of account. They have no concept that every price is a comparison between two things. And if you change the comparisons, you get different pictures. A lot of the world understands this. Venezuelans are more sophisticated in the currency markets than Americans. Even Argentinians today, Turkish people, Nigerian people, these people understand because they're constantly comparing their shitcoin to another shitcoin. It is only a matter of time before the world realizes that you're always supposed to compare to the strongest money. You don't compare to the weakest money because that's the liar. The liar is the weaker one. The stronger one tells the truth.